This is Counterpoint.
At least 95% of those 5.5 registered refugees by UNRWA should not be considered as refugees at all if we would apply international standards.
For Palestinians, it's a political idea. It's about saying we are refugees because the war is not over, Israel is not legitimate. Now, this is a Palestinian view. There's no reason for it to be supported by the EU.
Welcome to another episode of Counterpoint, recorded here in the studios of the European Parliament. In 1949, UNRWA was set up as a temporary agency to deal with about 500,000 to 700,000 Palestinian refugees from the 1948 Israeli-Palestinian Arab War. 70 years later, this temporary agency is still going strong and dealing with more than 5 million refugees. With me here in the studio to discuss how we arrived at this situation and what the implications are for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are Dr. Einat Wilf, public Israeli intellectual, former member of the Knesset for the Labour Party, and Adi Schwartz, a Middle East expert, journalist, formerly senior editor with Haaretz. Einat, perhaps introduce a little bit to us, to our viewers, how did this start and how did this mandate arrive at a situation that we are now dealing with over 5 million refugees from originally a population estimated to between 500,000 and 700,000?
So what we have discovered is that this issue is really at the core of the conflict. It's not a marginal issue, it's not some bureaucratic issue. After the Arabs have lost the war that they waged against the establishment of the State of Israel to prevent partition, which the United Nations just offered, when they lost the war, as in every war, there were refugees. The Jewish refugees were absorbed by Israel. The Arab refugees refused to be absorbed into Arab countries, and they wanted to continue the war because from their perspective, the fact that Israel was established was not a done deal. And they were willing to wait another generation, 2 or more, to continue their war. An agency was established by the West, by the UN, called UNRWA, as a temporary agency to help resettle the refugees, but the refugees refused to be resettled. So everyone wanted to close the agency, but the Arabs refused, and they demanded that the West continue to fund the agency. And the reason that the West caved into this Arab demand is that this was the 50s, the Cold War, they were concerned about communism, the free flow of oil, and they basically started paying an annual bribe to UNRWA in order to keep this thing alive. So 70 years later, it is still a temporary organization. We have almost 10 times as much people, by now a 5th generation, who are called refugees, but they are not refugees. And they are still stuck in this position where, unlike all the refugees in the world from the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, they refuse to move on and build their future.
So UNRWA is, as far as I understand, the only such agency that deals with refugees from a very specific conflict or region. All the other refugees in the world are handled by UNHCR, which also seems to have a slightly different mandate, right?
Yes. So basically around the same time, 49, 50, 51, 2 agencies were established, even more. One was the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to deal with all the refugees, initially of Europe and later in the world, and UNRWA for the conflict in Palestine. There was an UNRWA for Korea, but UNRWA and UNRWA were created as temporary agencies to finish a war, and UNHCR was to take care of everyone. UNHCR is an extremely successful agency. There are no more refugees from the wars of the 40s. And you had dozens, tens of millions of refugees as Europe created new countries, new borders, India, Pakistan. There's no refugees from those wars today because UNHCR works with a mandate that basically says move on. Right. Even if you can't return home, it doesn't exist, a new state has been created, you don't sit for 70 years waiting to undo that. You move on and you build a future. That's why South Korea today is prosperous and Ankara was closed down because people moved on. In Europe, you don't have refugees, and Europe is prosperous because people have moved on. Only with the Arab refugees, now called Palestinians, they have refused to move on, so they still have their agency, and they are stuck in this limbo. And we have a situation where all other refugees in the world are handled by UNHCR, and only the Palestinians are giving special status, special mandates, special definitions that allow them to persist in this notion that even though by any international standards, they would never be considered refugees. They're still allowed to be called refugees.
So it's a status that they can inherit in the second, third, fourth generation.
They can even have this status when they are citizens of Jordan. They can have this status when they have never left their country. By any international standard, they are not refugees, but UNRWA allows them to keep that status.
Adi, perhaps it's useful to break down a little bit the numbers. Where do these registered Palestinian refugees live?
So it's first important to know that we use the name refugees, but if you walk in those refugee camps, for example, in the West Bank, certainly in Jordan, you will see that they're simply neighborhoods. So the use of the word refugees in itself is misleading because people might think of people who are in real need and live in dire conditions, but these are actually middle class or lower middle class, normal neighborhoods where people live in concrete buildings, they have cars, they go in the morning to work, they come back. So this is not the classical type of refugee camp. But the numbers are as follow. At least 95% of those 5.5 registered refugees by UNRWA should not be considered as refugees at all if we would apply international standards. There are about 2.2 million living west of the River Jordan, that is in West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, these people cannot be considered refugees since they are in Palestine, certainly according to them. A basic idea that a refugee should be outside of his country. So if now a Palestinian lives in Gaza or in Nablus, where is his country? He is already there. For him, his country is inside Israel, but the international community should not recognize it, of course. Another 2.2 million registered refugees live in the Kingdom of Jordan. All these people were recognized as citizens in 1950, and their descendants, their children, their grandchildren. This is the unique case in the entire world where a person can be at the same time both a citizen and a refugee. So already have 2.2 million in Jordan, 2.2 living in the West Bank and Gaza, and then you have 1 million registered refugees on UNRWA's books, half of them in Lebanon and half of them in Syria. Just recently we knew from a census that the Lebanese government did that instead of 500,000, which are supposedly written on their books, there are only 170,000. So that's 1/3.
Where are the rest?
So they can be anywhere. They can be in Turkey, they can be here sitting in Brussels somewhere, in Europe, in the States. The problem is that UNRWA does not track the numbers. If you were born in Lebanon, you immediately get on UNRWA's lists. If you die, if you leave the country, there is no mechanism to verify where you are. You simply stay forever on their books.
Mm-hmm. Just to perhaps clarify, when you said that many of these refugees, certainly those who live in the West Bank and in Jordan, don't live in camps, they live usually in what from an outsider would be considered a normal neighborhood in this area. I think the situation in Lebanon is different, right? There the situation is much less comfortable and more camp-like.
True. The situation in Lebanon and Gaza is a little bit different. Lebanon from the early 50s has made it very difficult for Palestinian refugees to leave the camps. This is because of the unique structure of demographic structure of Lebanon with their Christian, Sunni, Shia, and Druze population. So they do not wish to see more Sunni Muslims enter their society. So they restrict them very much into their camps. They restrict their possibility to earn a living, and that's a different case. Also in Gaza, in some places, the refugee camps are I would say, not so much in a better condition, such as in the West Bank and in the Kingdom of Jordan.
Now, what are the implications of all of this for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Einat?
So the implications are that peace is impossible. As long as UNRWA continues to give international legitimacy. And we need to understand UNRWA, because it's still a temporary organization, is not funded directly from the UN budget, except for a few jobs. It is funded by voluntary contributions of Western countries. The EU today is the biggest donor to UNRWA. Many European countries, in addition, give money. So the EU, European countries, basically give the Palestinians year after year legitimacy, and giving money gives legitimacy to the Palestinian vision that the war is still ongoing, that Israel is temporary, that one day they will, what they call, return into pre-1967 Israel, meaning that Israel becomes an Arab country with a Jewish minority. This is how the numbers work. So, in the Palestinian ethos, the notion that they are still refugees, even after 70 years, and most of them, by the way, don't even live in the camps. It's not just the camps are now permanent habitats. In Jordan, more than 80% live outside. They are wealthy business people in Amman. In the West Bank, 75%. They live as middle-class lawyers in Ramallah. They are not refugees anymore, but for Palestinians, it's a political idea. It's about saying we are refugees because the war is not over, Israel is not legitimate. Now, this is a Palestinian view. There's no reason for it to be supported by the EU. And one of the messages that we bring, we have been to various European capitals, to Bern, to Berlin, to London, we're going to go to Stockholm, now we're in Brussels, is to bring a message, and both of us are from the Israeli peace camp, which is we're sick and tired. We want this conflict to be over. And if it's ever to be over, both sides need to understand that they can't have the entirety of the land. Now, Israel gets this message all the time from the EU, which is fine. But the Palestinians, not only do they not get the message that they will not have Palestine from the river to the sea, they get every year more than $1 billion that legitimize their vision of Palestine from the river to the sea. And we want the EU to stop closing its eyes to the fact that the EU, with its own money, is destroying the prospects for peace.
So this right of return that the Palestinian claims is, in your view, one of the major stumbling blocks to ever achieving a negotiated peace solution. As a matter of fact, many witness accounts of the peace process back with President Clinton and Prime Minister Barak underline that indeed this was one of the main reasons that Arafat in the end didn't sign. And the two of you authored a book called The War of Return, available at the moment only in Hebrew, but hopefully in about a year in English. But in your conversations, as you are now traveling throughout Europe, you have been to Berlin, you are now here in Brussels, and you're continuing, I believe, to Stockholm. What is the reaction of European officials, diplomats, parliamentarians that you meet when you confront them with this idea that they are ultimately fueling the conflict?
So what we usually meet is some kind of a reluctance to confront reality. Usually we heard the fact that we're just supporting social services and UNRWA is making some kind of humanitarian aid. The Palestinians need that aid. We cannot simply take away that money. And what we're saying and what we're suggesting is that aid can continue. We're not against aid, by no means. We are against the political dimension, giving this political right of, refugee status, which entails with it perhaps the right of return. So we see something like disbelief. They seem to don't understand the connection between this legitimacy, the money, more than $1 billion that's pouring every year, and the understanding of the Palestinians that it gives legitimization to the right of return. So the first point is that we see complete disbelief, or it's very uncomfortable for the European officials that we met to confront reality in that sense.
And in your conversations, when you explain this or try to explain this to your interlocutors, the question also ought to arise, why do they need so much aid in the first place 70 years, right? 70 years later. Isn't there a better way of helping Palestinian society also to be more independent, also economically?
This is precisely the notion, because sometimes in our meetings, we need to people have been subjected to 70 years of manipulations, of lies, and we're coming and saying this is all upside down. The reason that there is even need in Palestinian society, to the extent that it exists, as I said, many are wealthy business people, middle-class lawyers, but to the extent that there is need, it's not from an outside situation. There's no tsunami or earthquake that took place. It's all politics. The reasons that the Palestinians have this need in the first place is because they refuse to move on. And by continuing to feed it, you are never going to get rid of the need. Some officials tell us, okay, but this is for a negotiated peace, for final status. But we tell them it's the other way around. We will never get to peace if you continue to inflate this issue, if you continue to feed the resentment, if you continue to legitimize the idea that 70 years later, people are still at war. Everywhere in the world, people have moved on, built a future, made their countries prosperous. Even when they lost territories and lost wars and lost homes, they don't stay and stick and say, oh, we're still going to fight that war 70 years later. They build futures from themselves. This is why South Korea is a prosperous country. This is why Europe is a prosperous continent. People moved forward. The Palestinians remain where they are because they refuse to move forward. So it's exactly the opposite. The EU can throw billions and billions, and it does, into Gaza. Why is nothing changing? Because 80% of the people in Gaza get refugee cards from UNRWA. But they're in Gaza. Gaza is Palestine. Israel has no territorial claims in Gaza. So if someone lives in Gaza and they think they're a refugee, it means that they believe that their land is something that they still need to take back. So all the money that is being thrown in Gaza is literally sunk into tunnels in the ground because people don't want to make Gaza into the Singapore of the Middle East, into South Korea, into Europe. They use Gaza as a launching pad to continue to fight Israel because that's what they believe is legitimately theirs. And the EU is basically fueling a conflict and undermining its own policy. The EU official foreign policy is to make peace by means of two states. The EU money undermines that policy by telling the Palestinians that one day they will have Palestine from the river to the sea and that the Jewish state will be no more.
Another kind of reaction that we receive sometimes is that this is international law and the EU is somehow under the obligation to help these people. This is not political and they are refugees that we must help them. What we're saying that in itself, these sentences are buying into the Palestinian narrative. As we just said, they are not refugees. There is no such thing as the right of return. So accepting that this is somehow international law, buying into this UNRWA conception in itself is not a neutral move. In itself is taking sides. So you cannot just say that this is humanitarian or legal structure. In itself, it is taking sides in favor of the Palestinians.
Right. So to claim or to say, well, these are final status negotiations, we cannot publicly say, the right of return is not really feasible, but is in contradiction to actually funding an organization that in its very essence is driven by the right of return.
Exactly.
So the EU is not neutral in effect.
Exactly. If they wanted to be neutral, they could be really neutral and leave UNRWA. That would be a neutral act. But by giving money to UNRWA, by giving the Palestinians refugee cards, acknowledging the right of return, is not a neutral act.
Right.
It's a hostile act, and it's a pro-war actually.
Right. It's in contradiction, in your view, to the objective of reaching a negotiated.
Yeah, in a sense, we're just saying that the EU should align its policies with its actions. So
Right.
as Einat just said, they support and promote the two-state solution. On the other hand, they give money to a concept that is entirely contradictory. The idea that millions, a massive return of so-called refugees will flood Israel is of course a non-starter. And we know from the past that several negotiation processes have failed exactly because of that. Because at the last moment, everybody thought, oh, okay, they will simply give it up. No, they will not give it up. And by the way, if you really want them to give it up, start creating the conditions, start creating the atmosphere, even by grassroots meetings, even by NGOs inside the Palestinian society. How otherwise will they ever hear that they need to give it up? Inside Palestinian society currently, there's consensus that this is a holy issue. It is a private matter of each and every one of those 5.5 million people. Now, everybody who's a little bit realistic understands that this is complete nonsense. Israel will never, and rightly so, will never agree to such a concept. So if third party wants to be a constructive force towards peace, they must tackle it today, as soon as possible.
Wow. It looks like we need to bring you back for another round of discussion. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
For watching this, and please tune in again to our next episode of Counterpoint.